Okay, great. Well, I want to start by saying these three words pretty much sum up everything that drives me about design and my way of looking at design and my passion for thinking about the field and, pressing forward and saying, what do we need to know? What do we need to study? What do we need to investigate to bring it back and say, how can we keep thinking about these things that we're bringing into the world and making clarity and meaning possible for the people that we're trying to serve? So one thing that I love, this is a quote by Jorge Arango, and he said this a few years ago: the structural integrity of meaning across contexts is really what information architecture is trying to accomplish. And I really love that way of looking at it. And I want to think about the implications to that. So if we're worried about meaning, and architecture is what we're creating digital places, and we're filling these places up with these place-making objects from our object-oriented point of view. And by the way, we're making our place-making objects out of information. Information is our raw material by which we create these places and fill them up with these objects. And so there's a lot to say about how does this work? If what we're doing is making objects out of information, we ought to know how do humans engage with information and get meaning out of them? How does that work? So that was a very early interest that I had and followed. And I want to kind of sum up looking at this through the lens of embodied cognition, and a lot of the material that Sophia has kind of draws on this thinking and references a bunch of this stuff. So there's all kinds of good stuff in her work there. So I'm just going to summarize what I drew from it and how I think about embodied cognition. So if we have a human actor engaging with one of these objects that we made out of information, the actor is doing a few things. So the actor is anticipating what's possible with acting with that object. And the actor is, in order to act with it, they have to improvise and start to behave. And then as they're acting with the object, they start to align with what's actually happening. And they start to have to entrain with the way the object requires them to behave. And then that kind of feeds back, and that adjusts how they're anticipating what's possible. And then they align again with what's actually happening, and they adjust how they're improvising their behavior to entrain with how the object needs them to behave. And it becomes this feedback loop. And so the actor is both anticipating and aligning, improvising and entraining. And what this really struck me, because what this means is that instead of meaning being this point decision or moment of understanding, meaning is actually unfolding as the actor is acting with objects in the environment. So meaning is flow. And if meaning is flow, we know that flows have properties. And so that was really interesting to think about, to say, well, all right, if what we make our objects out of, our raw material, is information, then it stands to reason that what kind of information or the mode of information that we use to make our objects can influence the qualities of the flow of meaning. And so there's something there that I really wanted to dig into and explore. And it really makes us think that, very similar to an architect who's making a physical building and they're selecting from physical materials, yeah, a little bit for aesthetic qualities, but also how the materials will behave under certain conditions. What are their material properties? So we're kind of in that business of thinking about the properties of our information also. And so if we think about the different kinds of information that we have available to us, language in the air, projected language on a surface, text, and then all the kinds of perceptual information that we have, visual information, our choices in edges and surfaces and textures and color, and sound information, and mechanical information, haptics and things like that. we have all this whole array of raw material available to us. And we need to start thinking about what are the strengths of these different modes of information in facilitating the flow of meaning. In what conditions are these good and what conditions do they fail? Things like that. And so that led me to the question, is information like water? And if we look at water, if we look at a graph of all the different combinations of different pressure and temperature relative combinations, we get what we call the phase space of water. And the nature of water is very different depending on where you are in these different combinations. It's a solid, it's a liquid, it's a gas. And so I wanted to ask the question, can we do the same thing for information? If we look at the different relative amounts of language and perceptual informations in our designs, in these objects that we're creating, is there a phase space of information where we can kind of look at the different qualities in the feel of the flow of meaning? So if we think about perceptual information, perception flows easily, it's tacit, it's reflective, it's a different quality of engagement than actively thinking about it. When we think about language or conceptual information, language is viscous. It's laden with attentiveness and associativity, and it's a very different quality to the feel of the flow of meaning. And so if we look at these different relative amounts of perceptual and language information, there's some things that we can start to say about it. And so if we look at the region here where we've got a lot of language information and just a little bit or no perceptual information, well, we can never have zero. So I had a little blank spot there intentionally. But we can say that the area where we've got a lot more language information, it's an attentive way of engaging with meaning, and it's a very conceptual way of engaging with meaning. And when we have a lot of it, it requires intense concentration. And we can also think about kind of going up and down the scale here in terms of whether it's concrete, something like a chair, or abstract. You know, a chair, I can point to a chair. Space-time, can't really point to that. That's a lot more abstract. So that's a way to kind of think about ranging across the amounts of language. We can also think about just the amount of conceptual information that we're dealing with, and even the density of the conceptual information. And as we kind of go up in these things, it requires a lot more intense concentration and requires a lot more attentiveness. And so we would say something like a novel, we would map that up here in the very conceptual, sort of more intense concentration region of the phase space. And then on the other end here, where we're getting a lot more perceptual information, maybe less language, we start to move into a lot more reflexive way of engaging with meaning. And in this space where we have very little or no conceptual information, and it's all kind of perceptual, it's a very visceral way to engage with information. And when we have a lot of it, it requires intense coordination. So if we think about, if we have a lot, the amount of perceptual information is high, or it's very granular, it requires a lot more coordination to engage with it. Or if we have simultaneity, if we're trying to engage with visual and sound and haptics coming at us all at the same time. So that's the way I like to kind of look at these different regions of the phase space. Now, this is an example of a little data visualization where we look at, we have the years in the circle, and this is showing people's search habits for different topics. These happen to be food topics. And the different colors are different years. Purple is more recent year. And the farther out from the middle, the more intensely people are searching on these topics. And I believe this is US search data. So what we can see here is just at a glance, we get a sense that people search for blueberries throughout the year, but it's a lot more intense in the summer months in the United States. And when people search for stew, they don't search a lot. They do search throughout the year, but it's a lot lower in the summer months and a lot higher in the winter months. And then even seeing this trend that people searching for pumpkin spice latte is creeping further and further into September. I'm not a fan, but more for you guys, I guess, there. So we would plot something like this little data visualization. It's a very, there's a little bit of text, there's some concepts there, but it's a very visceral way to understand the meaning of the rhythms of people searching for food. I don't know how many people remember Twitter before we had images on Twitter. It used to be all text, just the tweets, all text. And so the way that we engaged with the information on Twitter was effectively reading words on a surface. And it was a very interesting mode of engaging with meaning because they were juxtaposed very different topics. And there was this really interesting accidental association that happened when you were reading across the different tweets. Yes, sure, we had a little perceptual information in terms of the avatars, and I should make those circles, Sophia, forgive me, I'll make them circles. But that's more like an annotation. So it's really just reading the text that was the main mode of engaging with Twitter. And then Twitter added images, and it really changed and kind of disrupted the mode in which we felt this flow of meaning. And suddenly, we were doing our usual meaning mode of reading the text and making these associative hops and kind of understanding and appreciating that part of Twitter. And suddenly that was disrupted by these swaths of perceptual information. And there were a lot of people that were very disrupted by that. And of course we got used to it, and we shifted the feel of it. But I think the point, though, is that Twitter phase shifted from one particular kind of mode of meaning to another. And we went with it, we adapted with it. And I think we can't really imagine Twitter without images now, but it's a very different mode of meaning than it was before. And the pendulum swings all the way around. So if you were to do a search for Wordle, which is the super popular game that's all over social media at the moment, you basically see a bunch of perceptual information. These are little data visualizations showing how people went through their process of guessing the word of the day. And yeah, there's a little text, but really that's just metadata, helpful for people like me trying to search and get some screenshots. But you can just scan through here and see that, okay, this person took 6 guesses, this person took 3, and so on and so on. And you can kind of get a sense of how they went about it just by the position and color and number of squares. And so you can even get a sense of whether people prefer dark mode or light mode. There's a few extra embedded details there. And so we phase shifted further when we look at a search result for something like this. Okay, and then of course in Twitter's nature, we tend to play with things. And so we're doing perceptual play and adding a little bit of annotation, like not Wordle, just Hello Kitty, and then making kind of meta commentary about the game. So we're playing with the phase shift there. Okay, now I want to kind of make a point about this. So there's something to be said about just mapping what's going on and where we are and how things are evolving over time. But we can also look at moving across the phase space within a given interaction with our objects. And an example is, very often we get alerts or the system nudges us because it needs to tell us of a state change or ask for a decision. And often these things start perceptual. We get a little sound or haptic vibration or a little glow, and then we get phase shifted to language. We get a little text that tells us something or asks us a question, and that can be fine. Phase shifting can be perfectly fine. But in situations where our users are deeply immersed in visceral information, they're engaging in this reflexive, high coordination way of dealing with information, maybe we want to keep them in that meaning mode. Maybe the cue or the nudge doesn't just start perceptual and phase shift, maybe it can stay perceptual and we communicate with perceptual information. At my company, our users are very geometry oriented. They do things like surfacing cars and dealing with geometry to design machinery. And a lot of it is conceptual, and they're making decisions and, statements about properties and things like that. But then a lot of it is they're dealing with the geometry and they're in that mode. And how do we respect that they're in that mode? Do we always need to phase shift them and have them phase shift back? So I think that's something it's interesting to consider as well. So do we have the appropriate meaning mode for the situation? And another example of this, we talk about our future of driverless cars, and it's really interesting to think about that, because the car is then overseeing all of this intense amount of perceptual information that normally we used to do. Visual information, sound about where people are, where other cars are, the haptics of the feel of the car, things like that. And if we're offloading all of that to a system, then when the system needs a decision from us or a nudge or something like that, how does the system communicate the current state of things? We could look out the window, but maybe there's a lot more to that. And if we have the system phase shift and just give us voice UI or language in the air, there's a lot of translation that has to be done there. And then we have to listen to that, translate that into what does that mean on the perceptual side, and then communicate back. And there's a lot of going back and forth across the phase space. So if we think about what, we're really powerful in picking up perceptual cues. I mean, this is 12 points of light, and we can see a human kicking a ball, and we can pick up a lot of information. We think this is not a child, this is an older human, and this human is pretty adept at kicking a ball. It's nice and smooth. So, if we have a situation where there's a lot of perceptual information and we need to make a decision and influence things there, can we stay in perceptual information? What would that look like? How do we represent the state of things when the meaning of the situation is the perceptual information? Okay, I want to give another example, because I think there's another aspect of this that we need to consider. So on the left here is kind of a little bit older image of a digital control panel for a car, but we still have buttons and labels and things like that. And let's say I'm the driver and I want to adjust the heating element on my driving seat. There's a button for that. I look at the display, and then I see that there's the driver button. And then I have to look at the display as I precisely put my finger on that button and engage with it. Okay, and then I will, on another screen, have to do something else and look at that. Now, there's a conceptual design. This was made quite a few years ago, but I think it's such a clever design. This is a concept for a control panel. It's a blank screen. And let's say I want to change the temperature in the ambient temperature in the car. I would just put my fingers somewhere on the screen, and depending on the number of fingers I put on the screen, it's controlling temperature or the volume of the audio or whatever you want to control. And I just kind of move my fingers up or move them down. And I'm adjusting the temperature or heat or whatever up or down. And then there's some nuances where you can make the circle bigger or smaller to make some other fine adjustments. But if we think about the difference here, I don't have to look at this display. I can just put my fingers on it and move it up and move it down. And I get enough perceptual information from the size of that ring and the fact that I'm moving it up or moving it down and how it's reacting, that I can just kind of glance at it and get a sense of where I'm making that adjustment. So that is a very different mode of engaging with meaning on these two ways of controlling your car temperatures. So the way I like to think of this is depending on the modes in which we, the modes that we use for the objects of our designs, we can actually influence how precise our users have to engage with our information. We just saw that car example. The different screens require, the one on the left required a lot of precision and a lot of concentration and looking. We had language labels, we had to read them, we had to precisely control where our finger was landing on the button, as opposed to the one on the right, where it's a lot more of a visceral understanding. Yeah, we have to remember that 2 fingers is temperature or 3 fingers is something else, but we just touch the screen, kind of move up is more, down is less. It's a lot more visceral way of engaging with information. So I think that's another aspect of what we can think about when we're placing our designs in the phase space. Okay, so kind of bringing this stuff back here. One of the big conclusions here is that because we are making these digital places and we're filling them with these place-making objects, and that's our architecture that we're making, they're made out of information. That's the raw material that we use to make these objects. And the kinds of information that we choose for our objects influence the qualities of the flow of meaning. That one thing that we can take away from this is that, as we're thinking about our objects and kind of going through the OOUX process and making sure they're real and meaningful and understanding their relationships to each other and understanding nested objects and attributes and all of that good stuff that we do in that process. Another element that we can think about is what kinds of information are we using to represent these objects? And, we use a lot of language and, we use perceptual information, but as we're moving into designs that are kind of escaping outside of screens and even in screens with a lot of information that we're trying to represent, is a more visceral, reflexive way of engaging. Is that appropriate? Is that going to suit the situation? Do we want language? Do we want to deliberately require attention? We can make a lot of choices with that. And so I think the big point there is that we want to align our meaning modes of our objects with what our digital places need. And so we're really thinking about that context there. So I want to stop there. Do we have questions from people?
I know I have questions. But okay. Thank you so much, Marsha. If y'all want to put some, you can put some gibberish in the chat, which is kind of somewhere in between. Like that's kind of the applause, is a way to do some Zoom applause, which is a little bit visceral and a little bit, yeah. What would that be? I guess emojis would be more visceral. Okay. Cool. Well, if you want to pull your screen down so we can see everybody, let's see. Where's the grid? Okay. Put your, if you have any questions, put them in the chat or we can just go off mute. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with the kind of like, I don't know if this is like just me or it's the elephant in the room, but like with OOUX, like the way that I was thinking about it when you were talking, it's all so interesting. This like added layer of thinking about the quality of the information and how you're presenting that information. And is this object, what is like the viscosity of this object? Is it more on that conceptual side or is it more on that perceptual side? I really feel like OOUX tends to pull us more into that visceral side. That's kind of what I teach, is like to take these like often really conceptual concepts, really kind of sometimes esoteric, abstract, that's the word I'm looking at, abstract concepts, and like put clear edges on them so they feel like something you can manipulate. They feel like something you can like, we concretize them, we can see how they relate to other stuff. And so kind of what I'm thinking of, this is such a weird metaphor, but you know how like there's omega 3s and omega 6s in nutrition, and like both are good, but like we have way more omega-6s in our diet. Like we don't get enough omega-3s and we need to like balance them out better. Any nutrition geeks out here. So I feel like the internet, I don't even know if this is a question. I just want you to react to it. But like the internet in general, like has too many omega-6s. Like it's too conceptual. Like there's all these like very conceptually language-based, hard to grasp. It feels like just sand through your fingers objects, or like not even objectified. It's just information that's kind of blurring across screens. And part of what OOUX is, it helps bring more that balance. So when it's appropriate, we can make them more visceral. I guess I'm just thinking like, is it ever like, when is it good, especially on the internet and with these digital places that already feel really abstract often and sometimes too abstract? When is it good for it to be more on that conceptual side versus the visceral side? Because I'm always going to want to pull it toward the visceral side.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you're saying that, because I also feel like sometimes you go into a system or website or tool or something and you don't feel the things. Like, so I totally get what you're saying. It's like, is it because they're using language, or is it just because they're, it doesn't always have to be like everything's loaded up with visualizations and all this stuff, but there is a thingness that we can do. We can do it with language. But that requires a particular craft, right? I think that's a really interesting point, Sophia. It does feel like where are the things? And I think part of it is they lose themselves as you go from page to page or activity to activity. They shapeshift, as you would say.
Yeah. And like, is it like, if you identify an object and you say, okay, this object is one, like, is it object by object or is it experience by experience too? Like, do we say like this experience is more of a visceral versus a conceptual experience? Or is it like within the experience, I can say, this is going to be a more like I'm doing some work with ed tech right now. So one of the objects is a focus area. Super conceptual. It's a lot of text versus a student, right? And a student can feel much more visceral, tangible than something like a focus area, which like I would even like, if I drew it, I would draw it as a cloud. So would it be object by object, or does it like this whole experience is going to be one versus the other? And we don't want to be constantly pushing and tugging the user through these different phase areas.
Yeah, I think looking at the surroundings too can help give some clues to that. Because are you already overloading visual information, sound information, haptics? So you have to look at the whole situation, and then you are integrating with all of that. Mm-hmm. And so that right there can help you start to decide if, the car example, visual information is already pretty important for the driver to be not hitting people and staying in the lane. So let's not have the designs in the car require a lot of visual information. So that's one. And then, I think the idea of within a given activity, phase shifting, it's not inherently a bad thing. I think it can be a powerful thing to start perceptual, shift to language, go back to perceptual. It just, as long as you're looking for the coherence, right? And what kind of meaning are you trying to achieve there? And looking for like, when is perceptual information of value and strong? And when is conceptual information of value and strong? One of the other talks that you had linked to, Sophia, in the meetup description, I talk about there's two types of behavior that we rely on information for. And I think that looking at what kind of behavior we're trying to do also helps you make decisions. So I didn't get into that in this talk, but I think there's a lot more to say about that.